Fidel Castro ruled Cuba for nearly 50 years. He entered history as the most passionate orator. His longest speech lasted 7 hours. More than 600 assassination attempts were made on his life. He came to power as a fighter against dictatorship under the slogans of democracy. However, just a couple of months later, he himself became a dictator. In the early years of Castro's rule, Cuba faced the most extensive economic sanctions in world history. In the Soviet Union, Cuba was referred to as the Island of Freedom, though in reality, it was an impoverished, sanctions-strangled country where history seemed to have come to a halt. Fidel Alejandro Castro's early years were marked by a happy childhood in Biran, a village in the Oriente province on the eastern side of Cuba. His official birth date is August 13th, 1926, although he was actually born a year later. His parents changed his birth year to enroll him in primary school at the age of 5. His father, Angel Castro, was a poor Spanish peasant who sought a better life in Cuba. At that time, the country had just gained independence from Spain. Angel Castro quickly became wealthy and owned a large sugar plantation. Fidel Castro's mother, Lina Ruz Gonzalez, worked as a cook on his father's estate. She gave birth to 5 children with Angel before he eventually married her. Despite Fidel Castro's parents being uneducated, they managed to provide all their children with a good education due to their financial means. Castro's interest in politics began to show in his childhood. For instance, it is known that in 1940, he wrote a letter to then-American President Franklin D. Roosevelt. In the letter, he congratulated the president on his third-term re-election and requested, "If it's not too much trouble, please send me an American $10 bill. I've never seen one, but I would really like to have it. Your friend." He provided the address of his school in the return address line. Surprisingly, Fidel received a response from the president's administration, albeit without the desired banknote. According to contemporaries' recollections, in his youth, Fidel Castro frequently got into fights and carried a pistol. Once, on a bet, he crashed his bicycle into a wall, which resulted in a hospital stay. However, the bet was won. After finishing school, Castro attended the privileged Jesuit college, Biran, and graduated with honors. In 1945, he entered the University of Havana's law school. As a student, Castro read extensively, including works by Mussolini, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky, José Martí, and Hitler's Mein Kampf. Interestingly, he once joked, "I am ready to become a communist immediately if they make me Stalin." As a successful revolutionary during his university years, Castro became involved in politics. The Cuban student community played a significant political role at that time and took a full stance. Castro, for instance, organized large rallies against the corrupt government of Cuba's then-president, Grau San Martin, known for his ties to criminal gangs. In 1952, a coup took place in Cuba, and power was seized by Fulgencio Batista. The Cuban Congress was dissolved, and legislative power shifted to the Council of Ministers. Constitutional guarantees were suspended for a month and a half, and soon the Constitution of 1940 was repealed. Fidel Castro found himself at the forefront of the struggle against the Batista regime. He prepared a lawsuit against the usurper, supported by evidence, and stated in court, "The artist must be sentenced to 100 years or more of imprisonment." Castro's manifesto had no positive consequences, but gradually, a large circle of supporters formed around the young politician. Soon, Castro and his companions began plotting the overthrow of Batista. It was decided to storm the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. It was believed that the fall of Cuba's second-largest fortress would exert psychological pressure on Batista, his supporters, and boost the spirits of the protesters. However, the attack failed, and Fidel Castro was arrested by a military tribunal. Castro delivered his famous speech, "History will absolve me," in which he strongly condemned the Batista regime and called on the Cuban people to armed struggle against tyranny. On September 21, 1953, Castro was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. However, the Batista regime wasn't as bloodthirsty as anticipated. Castro spent only 22 months in prison and was released under a general amnesty for Moncadistas in the same year. Fidel Castro emigrated to Mexico, where he began organizing a new uprising. On November 25, 1956, aboard the motor yacht Granma, Fidel Castro and his companions set sail for Cuba to initiate a revolution. The 18-meter diesel yacht was designed for 12 people, yet 82 were on board. The vessel headed into the Caribbean Sea at a speed of 7.2 knots. There was no time to waste as the ship had a leak. As a result, the entire crew suffered from severe seasickness. Among the ship's passengers was Argentine doctor Ernesto Che Guevara, who described the situation. The entire ship was a living tragedy. Men with anguish on their faces clutched their stomachs. Some simply buried their faces in buckets. Others sat still in strange poses, their clothes covered in vomit. The landing on Cuban shores also went awry. Many of the ship's passengers were killed or captured. Initially, Castro and his fighters posed no serious threat to the Batista regime. They could only carry out isolated operations, such as attacking police stations. However, over time, the movement gained strength. Supporters from the populace began joining Castro's ranks. By 1957, Fidel Castro's forces numbered several hundred people. Nevertheless, it seemed that suppressing them wouldn't be too difficult. Batista had several thousand armed soldiers at his disposal. Yet an unexpected turn of events occurred. When Batista sent his army to quell the rebels, the majority of them either dispersed or switched sides to join the revolutionaries. The revolution gained momentum. Castro's guerrilla units were transformed into a rebel army, with Fidel Castro as its supreme commander. On January 1, 1959, the rebel army entered Havana. Batista was overthrown and the formation of a new government, liberated Cuba, was announced. On the same day, immediately after Batista's downfall, the revolutionaries began forming a new government. Manuel Urrutia became the temporary president, liberal lawyer Miro Cardona became the prime minister, and Fidel Castro was appointed as the Minister of Defense. While the guerrilla war was ongoing, Castro told journalists that he wasn't interested in power. In particular, in an interview with Herbert Matthews of the New York Times, he stated, "I'm not interested in power. After victory, I will return to my village and practice law." However, the reality turned out to be quite the opposite. On February 15th, the country's prime minister, Miro Cardona, resigned, and Fidel Castro became the new head of the government. Initially, Fidel Castro enjoyed the support of a vast majority, up to 98% of the population. However, from the very first months, the situation began to change rapidly. While previously Castro had repeatedly declared he wasn't a communist, he started implementing overtly communist policies. The Cuban Revolution was initially conducted under democratic anti-dictatorship slogans. However, the groups that came to power quickly consolidated authority and became a dictatorship. Not only were political positions eradicated, but all independent civic organizations and movements, including trade unions, were eliminated. A strict censorship regime was established. Persecutions of dissent, even of a revolutionary nature, began. A multi-thousand militia was created to suppress dissidents. Initially, it was announced that only military criminals and officials of the Batista regime would be tried. For instance, on January 12, 1959, a show trial was held for 72 police officers connected to the Batista regime. They were all executed. The turning point came with the first agrarian reform law. On May 17, 1959, a new law came into effect, according to which land plots larger than 400 hectares were to be expropriated from owners and redistributed among peasants. Some peasants supported this law. However, wealthy landowners opposed this forced collectivization, seeing it as robbery. This resulted in a massive peasant uprising in the mountains of Camagüey, which evolved into a new guerrilla war lasting several years. The insurgents were brutally suppressed by the government army in the Limpia operation. According to some estimates, the purges claimed around 4,000 lives. Another wave of repression in Cuba occurred after the so-called Bay of Pigs invasion, or Playa Girón invasion. An attempt was made to overthrow Fidel Castro's regime with the help of the CIA. The operation failed, but afterward, not only were all participants arrested, but lists of undesirables were compiled. The number was so high that stadiums and other public places were converted into concentration camps. In the 1960s, on the Island of Freedom, an estimated 7,000 to 10,000 people were executed, and the number of prisoners reached 30,000. The country ordered the creation of the UMAP, Military Units to Aid Production Labor Camp System, which existed from 1965 to 1968. People could be sent to these camps for offenses such as drunkenness, drug addiction, vagrancy, homosexuality, excessive religiosity, or even listening to imperialist rock and roll. This category of criminals was referred to as rockeros. Prisoners in the camps were subjected to inhumane conditions. They were forced to work in their underwear, and those who transgressed were made to cut grass with their teeth or were submerged in dirty pits for several hours. In Cuba, there were and still are camps where the authority is in the hands of supervisors selected from among the prisoners themselves. According to calculations by American human rights groups, the Castro regime imprisoned and sent to concentration camps 3 times more political prisoners as a percentage of the population than Hitler and Stalin did during the same period. At one point, there were 100,000 people in political prisons simultaneously. For comparison, during the Batista regime in Cuba, there were 500 political prisoners from all walks of society. Under the dictatorship of Gerardo Machado, the number was around 5,000. Many prisoners served sentences of 20, 30 years or life. Thousands of regime opponents were beaten, tortured, confined to cramped cells where sitting or lying down was impossible. According to the Black Book of Communism published at Harvard, the regime executed 14,000 people aged 16 to 68. According to the organization Freedom House, during the years of the Castro regime, 500,000 Cubans passed through the camp and torture chamber system. Island of blockade. By the early 1960s, almost all sectors of Cuba's economy were developing thanks to American private investment. From the production of cigars, rum, and sugar to shipyards, machinery, and electronics. Upon taking power, the commander decided to nationalize the property of American citizens and signed the corresponding decree. This nationalization affected both large companies and ordinary U.S. citizens who, unfortunately, had bought homes or land on Cuba. Castro justified his decision with the following words: "Capitalism has no moral or ethical values. Everything is for sale. It is impossible to properly educate the people under such conditions. People become egoists, and sometimes even bandits." This event divided Cuba's history into before and after. The U.S. reaction followed immediately. An embargo on supplying any goods to Cuba, except for food and medicine, was imposed. Countries and companies that did not comply with it faced sanctions and a rupture of relations. In 1962, John F. Kennedy signed a directive on a complete trade blockade. Cuba was then excluded from the Organization of American States and was completely cut off from all trade routes. The situation worsened due to the Cuban Missile Crisis. The USSR deployed nuclear warheads on Cuba. Thanks to its friendship with the Soviet Union, the Cuban economy managed to stay afloat. The USSR provided Cuba with about $3 billion in aid annually, bought rum, cane sugar, and tobacco at inflated prices, and supplied essential goods. However, by the late 1980s, the era of global socialism was coming to an end. The Soviet Union collapsed, and Cuba entered its most difficult times. After the fall of the USSR, Cuba lost 185% of its trading connections in just a few years, from 1989 to 1993. The country's GDP shrank by almost 40%. Foreign technical specialists who supported its industry began leaving the republic. In particular, 7,000 Soviet specialists left Cuba. In addition, in 1992, the U.S. further tightened its sanctions policy and prohibited money transfers to Cuba. Previously, Cuban immigrants could send currency to their relatives and somehow replenish the country's reserves. This flow has now ceased. Since 1962, a ration card system has been introduced in Cuba, which has not been revoked to this day. The system of distributing goods through ration cards has undergone multiple changes and improvements. From birth, every Cuban citizen is assigned to a local store. From the government, they receive their ration in the form of a monthly food package. It includes 3 kilograms of rice, half a kilogram of beans, a kilogram of pasta, 2 kilograms of sugar, a bottle of soybean oil, half a kilogram of coffee, a dozen eggs, salt, chicken meat, fish, and a sausage stick. Additionally, the government provides Cubans with coal, kerosene, or gas cylinders, depending on the type of stove at home. However, these measures did not help cope with the country's ongoing economic crisis. Electricity was constantly being disconnected due to resource shortages. Epidemics broke out repeatedly due to a lack of medicines, and infant mortality increased. Nevertheless, the elderly commander remained steadfast, even as all countries in the socialist bloc were forced to admit the insolvency of their economies. Fidel Castro was unwilling to change his convictions for any reason. Moreover, all these economic problems did not personally affect his light dictatorship charm. In 2006, Forbes magazine compiled a ranking of the 10 richest kings, queens, and dictators. In this list, among others, the Cuban leader Fidel Castro was included. The publication estimated the commander's fortune at $900 million. Fidel Castro was greatly displeased with these calculations and even planned to sue the publication. He stated that it was all slander and that he lived on 900 pesos a month, $43, like many of his compatriots, and that all his real estate consisted of fishermen huts and apartments in Havana. However, in 2014, the book Fidel Castro's Double Life was released. The reaction to this book had the effect of a bombshell. The author of this book, Juan Reynaldo Sanchez, a former bodyguard of the commander who served him for 17 years, wrote, "Fidel was like a god to me. I was always ready to die for him." However, everything changed when I heard him with Colombian drug traffickers. These are the opening words of the book. In 2008, Sanchez fled from Cuba to Mexico and then to the USA. In his book, the former confidant of the commander wrote that Castro ruled the country as his own domain and was something between a medieval lord and Louis XV. Sanchez also noted that Fidel's lifestyle was something that ordinary citizens of the Island of Freedom could never imagine. Despite his claims, Fidel never gave up capitalist comfort. The former bodyguard wrote that the commander would wake up late and wouldn't start work until after noon. After a moderate breakfast, his favorite movie was Sergei Bondarchuk's War and Peace, which Castro watched many times. He preferred Scottish whiskey over domestically produced rum, and he drank it with a few pieces of ice. He smoked Cuban cigars, but he kept Angolan diamonds in the box under them, reminding Sanchez of a pirate of the Caribbean. According to Sanchez, Fidel Castro owned about 20 luxurious properties. One of them was the private island of Cayo Piedra, located south of the Bay of Pigs. Here, the commander entertained expensive guests, such as writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, with whom he spent time spearfishing. Castro also had a turtle breeding farm and a private dolphinarium on the tropical island. Luxurious real estate was also owned by Castro in the Cuban capital. In his estate in Havana, the commander had a medical center, a basketball court, a rooftop bowling alley, and a private pier. Yes, Fidel Castro reached his own island on a personal yacht named Aquarama II. Her finishing was done using valuable wood species from Angola, while 4 engines allowed for high speeds. According to a former bodyguard, the yacht was gifted to the commander by the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. The cars that Castro used for transportation were also often gifts from the USSR. However, unlike yachts, Castro didn't have a special interest in cars. In April 1963, during a visit to the Soviet Union, Castro visited the Likhachiev plant, where he was gifted an open ZIL 111V on behalf of Nikita Khrushchev. The car reached Cuba in September of the same year. In the USSR, it was one of the first cars with an automatic transmission. As his everyday vehicle, Castro also used another Soviet car, the military off-road vehicle Gaz-69. However, in the commander's garage, there were also foreign cars. As Juan Sanchez writes in his book, Castro used them in the process, accompanied by at least 10 guards and 2 personal blood donors. He also kept a loaded pistol at his side. To the world, Fidel Castro is remembered as a man in a military uniform of dark green color and a cap with a wide brim. In his later years, his favorite attire became a tracksuit. But beneath his modest clothing, Castro also had a place for expensive accessories. In 1963, during his visit to the USSR, the Cuban leader was seen wearing 2 Rolex watches on his wrist. Some reporters at the time speculated that one showed Russian time, while the other showed Cuban time. Judging from archival photos, Castro had an extensive collection of Rolex watches. However, one of his favorites was the Submariner model. He was captured wearing it in a photograph in Life magazine in 1959 on the balcony of the Hilton Hotel after the rebel armies triumphantly entered Havana. 638 ways to kill Castro. Fidel Castro entered the Guinness World Records for two reasons. Firstly, as the most passionate orator. His speech at the UN on September 26, 1960, lasted for 4 hours and 29 minutes. However, this wasn't his longest speech. At the Third Congress of the Cuban Communist Party in 1986, Fidel Castro spoke for a total of 7 hours and 10 minutes. Castro set his second world record in the number of assassination attempts on his life. His bodyguard Sanchez claims there were around 200 attempts. However, some believe there were more than 600 attempts on Castro's life. A documentary film titled 638 Ways to Kill Castro was aired on British television. The film reveals numerous assassination attempts, including poisoned cigars, scuba diving tanks with tuberculosis bacteria, bombs in baseball bats, pen syringes, and much more. Both the American government and Cuban opposition were behind these attempts. Additionally, American mafia groups despised Castro. After coming to power, the commander took control of the famous Havana casinos and brothels. However, Castro was remarkably lucky and didn't suffer harm from any of the attempts. He once said, "If the ability to survive assassination attempts were an Olympic event, I would win the gold medal." Fidel Castro passed away from natural causes at the age of 90 on November 25, 2016, outliving most of those who had planned to eliminate him. And this video was prepared by Hustler. If you liked this video, subscribe to the channel, leave your comments. See you next time.